The war that ended the world started on October 9, 1971. Tensions had been brewing for years between America and the Soviet Union. And even though people had done their best to keep a sense of normalcy, everyone was wondering when the Cold War that had been brewing for the past 30 years would boil over. There were those who had been preparing for it for years, while others assumed that it would never amount to anything. Neither nation wanted to make the first nuclear strike, and even if that happened, the engineers would come out of their underground cities to intervene. But nobody knew for sure if the two world superpowers could ever come to an agreement, or if it would all end in total destruction. October 9th was the day that question was finally answered. The first American nuclear warhead detonated over the Gulf of Finland, only a few miles away from the city of Leningrad, where people were going about their day blissfully unaware of the destruction that was about to befall them. First came a citywide blackout, as the power grid was bombarded with a huge surge of radiation that caused bulbs to blow and wires to glow like they'd been struck by lightning. There was barely any time to react before the next wave hit, a white-hot flash so bright that many of those who couldn't get to cover were blinded. The third wave, by far the most destructive, was the force of the explosion itself. Like a powerful burning wind, it swept through the city, breaking windows, knocking over streetlights, ripping the leaves off trees, and bathing every car, building, and person with ash. People are trapped under the debris as some of the city's older, less well-maintained buildings come crumbling down. Even though the Soviet government had been preparing for this day to come, and the Russian people had been put through mandatory safety drills, no amount of practice or planning could have prepared them for the real thing. The streets erupted into chaos. Cars were crashing into buildings, either because their drivers had been blinded by the light of the distant explosion, or because the initial wave of radiation had shorted their batteries. People nearly trampled each other trying to get to underground shelters, as police and military tried to yell directions over the cacophony. Among the crowd, a family desperately tried to stay together. Irina and Nikolai Belitrov held tight to their children, Alexei and Tatiana. The whole family was still in their pajamas and barely had time to get their shoes on before they started rushing towards the neighborhood's designated underground bunker. Irina had Tatiana, who was only 2, clutched tight to her chest, and Nikolai tried his best to keep 10-year-old Alexei's eyes shielded as they walked past the dead bodies of people who were once their friends and neighbors. "It'll be all right soon, son," Nikolai said, as much as to try and convince himself as his son. "We're going underground, just like in the safety drills." Alexei nodded solemnly and kept his gaze straight ahead. They were almost at the end of the street, when just above the sounds of air raid sirens and screaming people, Alexei heard a familiar voice. "Alexei! Alexei!" The boy looked down to see his teacher, Mr. Petrov, trapped in the wreckage of his car. He must have been driving to work when the bomb struck.
"Father, stop!"
Alexei yelled, tugging at his father's shirt sleeve.
"That's my teacher. We have to help him or he won't make it to the shelter."
"The soldiers will help him once everyone else is in," said Nikolai. Alexei didn't listen. He wriggled free of his father's grip and ran to where his teacher lay pinned under the wrecked vehicle. Nikolai was calling after him, and though Irina wanted to wait for Alexei to come back, she was swept up in the tide of people and separated from her husband. Mr. Petrov was crying, thanking Alexei for coming to his aid. As Alexei got closer, he saw there was blood pooling out from under the wreck. It seemed if Mr. Petrov were going to make it out, his legs would likely be badly damaged. Alexei tried to lift the car himself, but even though he was strong for his age, he was still only a child. A soldier who had been helping people into the bomb shelter stopped what he was doing and ran over to Alexei.
"Hey kid!"
the soldier shouted.
"Leave him alone and go back to your family. You're going to hurt yourself."
Alexei kicked and struggled against the soldier's grip as he was dragged back into the line with his family.
"But he's in trouble!"
Alexei cried. "It's not your job to save him," his father scolded, as he took his hand and led him down the stairs where they would rejoin his mother and sister. As Alexei and his father descended into the tunnels, Alexei heard a gunshot from the street above. Though he would survive long after that day, he never saw his teacher, Mr. Petrov, again. He never asked his father about what happened. The Belitrov family was reunited in the underground shelter, which had once been an underground train station. Tatiana had started crying, and Nikolai tried desperately to quiet her. Irina hugged her son so tight he felt she might squeeze the life out of him. They were packed in with a dozen other families, some they knew and others who were strangers. Alexei recognized some of the other children from school and saw that some were there without their parents. While they were in the station, a soldier addressed the group and explained what would happen next. The train station was to serve as their temporary shelter until the proper negotiations were made with the engineers. As per a treaty that had been written and signed after the Second World War, the engineers had agreed to open the borders of their underground civilization to humans fleeing from a crisis above ground. Once the government had made a decision, the survivors were to be taken deep underground, where they would live until the war was over. Above ground, the Soviet Union began dealing with the fallout of the initial attack. It was clear that America could no longer be dealt with reasonably if they were willing to bomb one of the USSR's biggest cities. Though the bombing had cut communications between Leningrad and Moscow, eventually contact was re-established, and the army was able to radio the Kremlin with a full report on the damage. Leningrad was in ruin, with over a third of the population dead or otherwise too wounded to move underground. Those who had made it underground were receiving treatment from everything from broken bones and blindness to radiation poisoning. In a word, it was chaos. Russian parliament was quick and ruthless in their decision to strike back. On October 12th, Secretary Brezhnev authorized nuclear missiles to be launched at both New York City and Washington, D.C. Millions were killed, and just like in Russia, the survivors retreated underground. America didn't go down without a fight though, and launched another missile attack, this time at Moscow. It wasn't long before both countries' allies were involved in the conflict as well, with missile strikes coming from France, China, North Korea, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Within a month, the surface of the Earth was dangerously irradiated, and any humans who were still living had retreated underground. But though the world had ended, the war had not. Alexei Belitrov and his family struggled to adjust to their new life underground. Though the engineers were intelligent and human-like, their world was so different from the world Alexei had lived in for the first 10 years of his life. He barely ever saw them. The engineers were nocturnal, sleeping while an artificial sun nourished the genetically engineered plants that grew around the city. But any time he tried to ask questions about them, he was met with hushed silence by the adults. The engineers were spoken of in hushed, almost reverent tones. They were the beings that saved humanity, yes, but they had also helped build the weapons that led to the war in the first place. Alexei barely had any time to settle into this new life before what remained of the Russian army started looking for new recruits. Reports had come in from an above-ground scout that the Americans were working on a new type of armor that could fully shield the wearer against radiation, and the Soviets could not afford to be outmatched when their army was still recovering from multiple nuclear attacks. But the army wasn't asking for able-bodied adult men to enlist. They were looking for children. "We can't possibly send our son to war," Irina said. Arguments at the dinner table had become common in the Belitrov family. "He would not be going to war," Nikolai argued. "Not until their new anti-radiation technology is perfected. He won't be ready until he's an adult." "How do you know that what they're making in those labs won't kill him?" Irina said. "Do we really want to trust these underground devils with our son? How much do we really know about the engineers anyway?" "They could have let us all burn on the surface," Nikolai said. "But they didn't. I think we should trust them." "I want to go," said Alexei. "I should. Some of my friends have already enlisted." Both of his parents were stunned, but it made sense to Alexei. He wanted the war to be over, and he wanted to leave the underground city. But most importantly, he wanted to know if anyone was still alive on the surface. If there was even a sliver of chance that it could be habitable again, he wanted to find out. After much discussion, Irina and Nikolai agreed. It was what was best for the future of Russia, and ultimately, the future of the human race. Alexei's parents delivered him to the Office of Army Recruitment, and he was taken by a man named Commander Volkov to a specialized research facility. This was when Alexei met an engineer for the first time. The engineer was tall and hairy, like a bear walking on its back legs, but with face and hands more like a human's. He was overseeing a group of humans and other engineers as they tinkered with machines that Alexei couldn't even begin to guess the purpose of. "Do not be frightened, Alexei," Commander Volkov said. "They're going to explain the procedure to you before you have to agree to anything." The engineer looked the boy over, then held up a jar containing something that looked like an insect's exoskeleton. It was green, the same shade as the USSR's army uniforms. "This is our new bioorganic armor prototype," the engineer said. "We can only graft it onto you while you are still growing. It must grow with you, starting on your back, then moving to your limbs, then your head." Alexei was frightened by the idea, but didn't want to seem weak. He wanted to make sure his father would be proud of him. He was taken into surgery, where the team of engineers and human doctors grafted the plate of bioorganic armor onto his spine. Once the surgery was over, he was wheeled into a recovery room, where he was fed a simple meal alongside all of his friends and classmates. They had all gone through the same procedure. Over the next 8 years, Alexei and his comrades went through the painful process of growing their exoskeleton. Like the engineer had said, it grew with them, but the growth happened in painful spurts rather than gradually. The worst thing about the armor was that it couldn't be removed, but it gave them many advantages to normal soldiers as well. Once it covered Alexei's legs, he found he could jump higher and run farther than any human normally could. When it grew over his arms, it gave him increased strength. By the time he was 18, it had covered his head, giving it a fly-like appearance, but also granting him stereoscopic vision and the ability to hear radio transmissions without the need for any other communication device. During this time, he and the other boys were trained by Commander Volkov, learning how to use the powers granted to them by their exoskeletons for combat. When they were deemed ready, they were all outfitted with shoulder cannons, supply packs, and guns, all of which were also bioorganic and were surgically attached. It had been 8 long years since the end of the world, and Alexei was now able to set foot back on the surface. The world he returned to was almost unrecognizable. There were no signs of life outside of weeds and vines overtaking the irradiated ruins of buildings. Within the first hour of returning to the surface, Alexei gave up any hope of finding survivors. He heard Volkov's voice barking orders through the suit. There was no time to reminisce about the past. The soldiers had a job to do. Want an anomaly of your own? Check out scpswag.com for high-quality SCP merch. Now go check out SCP-2273 Major Alexei Belitrov and what actually happened to Major Alexei Belitrov SCP-2273 tale for more from the story of this interdimensional soldier.